the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour quickly became one of the boldest shows on American television. Instead of playing it safe, Tom and Dick brought on performers who challenged the system. They invited folk singers like Pete Seeger, who openly sang anti-war songs at a time when the country was deeply divided. They even poked fun at President Lyndon Johnson on national TV, something most shows would never have dared to do. Every episode felt unpredictable, and every episode came with a sense of risk. CBS censors constantly tried to control them, but the brothers fought back. Sometimes they even turned censorship itself into part of the comedy, making the restrictions obvious to the audience in clever and funny ways. Their rebellious spirit was matched by their groundbreaking team of writers. Young talents like Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, Lorne Michaels, and David Steinberg worked behind the scenes, writing jokes that mattered and breaking the old rules of television. Many of those writers would go on to shape the future of American comedy with shows like Saturday Night Live, All in the Family, and The Mary Tyler Moore Show. In 1968, the show made television history by giving American audiences something they had never seen before. On October 6th, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour aired the Beatles' promotional film for Hey Jude. While people in the UK had already seen it in early September, this was the first time US audiences got to experience it. Back then, these films weren't called music videos yet. They were known as promotional films. Hey Jude was filmed on September 4, 1968, at Twickenham Studios, with Paul McCartney personally designing the set. A full orchestra dressed in white tuxedos played along, and around 300 extras joined in singing the famous ending. It was also a big moment for the band because Ringo Starr had just returned after briefly quitting. The following week, the Smothers Brothers aired Revolution, giving viewers back-to-back Beatles films that no other show in America could offer. Not even The Ed Sullivan Show. It was a turning point not just for music but for how television could connect artists to fans. Another unforgettable moment came in 1967, when Pete Seeger returned to television after being blacklisted for nearly 17 years. He performed Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a powerful song criticizing President Johnson's Vietnam policies. CBS refused to air it in September of that year, cutting the performance before it could reach the public. But Tom Smothers refused to stay silent. He spoke to the press, and the story exploded. Public outrage forced CBS to allow Seeger back on the show. On February 25, 1968, millions of people finally saw him sing the song uncensored. It was one of the first times a blacklisted artist openly criticized a sitting president on national television, and it proved that protest music could break through barriers and make history. Between 1967 and 1969, the Smothers Brothers also gave a national platform to bands most networks considered too risky. They welcomed The Who, The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, Buffalo Springfield, and Steppenwolf, groups whose rebellious energy reflected the mood of the era. The Who famously destroyed their instruments during one performance, with Keith Moon setting off explosives inside his drum kit. The blast was so intense it damaged Pete Townshend's hearing and sent shrapnel flying across the stage. The Doors appeared with a full orchestra to perform Touch Me, while Jefferson Airplane sang Crown of Creation, a song about nuclear war and the threat of destruction. Buffalo Springfield played their protest anthem For What It's Worth, and Steppenwolf delivered a raw, electrifying performance of Born to Be Wild. None of these were safe choices for mainstream television, but that was exactly the point. The Smothers Brothers weren't trying to play it safe. They were trying to give space to voices that other networks ignored. They believed TV could be more than entertainment. It could be a stage where culture, politics, and music came together to reflect the truth of the times. The rebellious spirit of the Smothers Brothers was admired by many of the biggest names in music. On April 26, 1969, during a concert at the Los Angeles Forum, Jimi Hendrix paused before playing a song and dedicated his performance to Tom and Dick Smothers. He called them heroes for giving art, protest, and truth a voice on national television. At that moment, Hendrix was at the peak of his career, yet he chose to honor two comedians whose show had just been cancelled by CBS for being too controversial. His words reminded everyone that what the Smothers Brothers had done mattered. They had created a space where comedy and music blended with politics and honesty in a way no one else had dared. That mixture of humor and rebellion was clear in recurring sketches like Share a Little Tea with Goldie. Actress Lee French played Goldie O'Keefe, a wide-eyed hippie who handed out silly, clever advice filled with double meanings. Everyone knew tea was slang for marijuana, and Goldie's original last name, Keefe, was itself a slang word for cannabis before censors forced a change. She spoke about roaches, and it was obvious to younger viewers that she wasn't talking about insects. The sketch became a cult favorite because it felt like the show was secretly winking at its audience, speaking directly to the younger generation while the censors pretended not to notice. But it wasn't only comedy sketches that shocked viewers. The music did too. On September 17, 1967, The Who took the stage to perform My Generation, and drummer Keith Moon decided to make it unforgettable. Without telling anyone, not even his bandmates, he packed his kick drum with live explosives, far more than what had been approved. When the finale hit, the blast was deafening. Smoke and fire shot across the stage. A piece of a cymbal flew into Moon himself, knocking him backward, while the explosion blew Pete Townshend's hair into the air and damaged his hearing permanently. The blast was so powerful that Townshend lost almost 90% of the hearing in one ear, a painful ringing he carried for the rest of his life. The stage was chaos. Smoke everywhere, debris scattered across the set, and the audience stunned into silence before erupting into screams and cheers. In the middle of the madness, Townshend grabbed Tom Smothers' acoustic guitar and smashed it into pieces right there on stage. Tom could only stare in shock as the crowd roared. It was pure rebellion, loud, destructive, and unforgettable. That single performance went down in rock history as one of the most shocking moments ever broadcast on television. Young viewers loved the wild spectacle, while many parents were horrified. It symbolized the generational divide of the 1960s, a battle between tradition and rebellion, and the Smothers Brothers were right at the center of it. The show also gave a stage to Joan Baez, one of the most powerful voices in the fight for peace and social justice. By 1967, Baez had already been arrested for protesting and had become a symbol of resistance against the Vietnam War. When she appeared on the Comedy Hour, she wanted to dedicate a song to her husband, David Harris, who was about to serve 3 years in prison for refusing the draft. She spoke proudly of his decision and his courage, but CBS cut almost all of her dedication, leaving only a vague introduction before her song. It was another clear example of the network bowing to political pressure. The interference only grew worse. President Lyndon B. Johnson himself had personally complained about the show, once staying awake until 3 a.m. to call CBS and demand that the brothers be silenced. When Richard Nixon became president, he pushed even harder to have the show cancelled. In 1968, Harry Belafonte prepared a daring performance for the show, singing Lord, Don't Stop the Carnival while footage of police beating protesters at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago played in the background. It was one of the most powerful protest moments ever filmed for television, but CBS never allowed it to air. Instead, the network sold the 5 minutes they had cut to the Republican Party for campaign ads. What was meant to be a searing critique of political violence was replaced by political propaganda. By the end of 1968, CBS had placed the Smothers Brothers under relentless pressure. Every single script, joke, song, and even the videotapes of the finished episodes had to be sent to censors long before airtime. It wasn't a quick check. It was an exhaustive review where every word was examined, every phrase scrutinized. The network wanted complete control, but the more they tried to silence Tom and Dick, the more obvious it became that the brothers were fighting for something much bigger than just a comedy show. CBS's censorship reached the point where it became almost unbearable. They picked apart every line, every song lyric, and every joke, hunting for anything that even hinted at politics, religion, or the Vietnam War. Even harmless jokes were sometimes cut, and guest stars with edgy humor were either heavily censored or removed completely. The deadline for submitting each episode was pushed to 10 days before air, which at the time was an unusually harsh rule designed to stop the brothers from sneaking in last-minute changes. Writers found themselves trapped in an exhausting cycle of revising, resubmitting, and waiting for approval. Many described the process as death by 1,000 cuts, because the network chipped away at everything they created until almost nothing was left. Tom and Dick decided to fight back. They wrote a sketch where Tom played a censor himself, walking around with oversized scissors and literally cutting scripts apart while silencing performers mid-sentence. The punchline was striking. The only thing left on screen was silence. It was a direct shot at what CBS was doing to them. But the network refused to air the sketch, saying it made CBS look bad. Another skit by Elaine May was also banned. She ended hers with the line, "If we're not allowed to say anything important, we're just fooling you with empty jokes." Cut deep. Tom, this was the final straw. Even poking fun at censorship itself had been censored. The brothers refused to back down completely. They began playing games with CBS over deadlines, sometimes sending in a safe version for review but sneaking in riskier edits at the very last moment before broadcast. The network grew furious, accusing them of violating their contract. In April 1969, CBS finally acted. They announced that the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was cancelled because the team had failed to deliver an episode on time. In reality, evidence later showed that CBS itself had caused some of the delays. The official reason was just a cover. The true issue was control. Tom and Dick were speaking too freely, and the network wanted them silenced. When the cancellation was announced, the show was still one of the top 10 most-watched programs in the United States. Tom Smothers later said that CBS had carefully planned to choke off their voice, waiting for an excuse. The fight spilled into the national press. The New York Times ran an editorial accusing CBS of turning the Smothers Brothers into prisoners of their own creativity. Public support poured in. Fans wrote letters and staged protests. Artists, comedians, and politicians defended them, saying this wasn't just about one comedy show. It was about free speech on American television. CBS executives panicked over the backlash, but there were other forces at work. Corporate sponsors like Ford and Procter & Gamble were pulling their advertising, worried that being connected to the Smothers Brothers' sharp anti-war jokes would alienate customers. Internal memos revealed that losing sponsors and millions of dollars in advertising revenue was one of the biggest reasons CBS finally cut ties. It didn't matter that the show was popular. Advertisers had sent a clear message. Speak too freely and you'll pay the price. The final straw came when Dick Smothers performed an impression of President Nixon in March 1969. He joked, "I will end the Vietnam War as soon as I can find where the off button is." It was short, sharp, and honest, but CBS and its sponsors were outraged. The war was too sensitive, Nixon too powerful, and the network too afraid. On April 4, 1969, CBS pulled the plug on the show immediately. The decision stunned everyone. Just weeks earlier, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour had been renewed for another season. An episode had already been filmed featuring comedian David Steinberg delivering another anti-war message, but it never aired in the United States. CBS refused to broadcast it, instead allowing it to air only in Canada. The cancellation was swift and brutal. It showed the entire entertainment industry that pushing the boundaries of politics on TV came with serious consequences. The Smothers Brothers didn't walk away quietly. They sued CBS for breach of contract, beginning a legal battle that lasted 4 years. In April 1973, they won. A judge ruled in their favor, awarding them $776,300, more than $5.5 million in today's money. The victory set a precedent, showing that networks couldn't simply use censorship as an excuse to shut down voices they didn't like. Tom later admitted that even though they won in court, they lost something bigger, the culture war. The message had already been sent loud and clear. If artists dared to challenge authority, even a hit show could be silenced. Winning the lawsuit against CBS brought some justice for Tom and Dick Smothers, but the victory felt hollow. By then, they had already lost their stage, and no future project ever recaptured the magic of their groundbreaking comedy hour. They tried again with a more cautious version of their show on NBC, but it failed to connect with audiences. CBS, meanwhile, wasted no time replacing them. On June 15, 1969, just months after canceling the Smothers Brothers, CBS launched Tee Haw, a light-hearted rural comedy filled with country music and corny jokes. It had no politics, no sharp satire, and no controversy. It was exactly the kind of safe program CBS wanted, and it went on to run for 23 seasons. Its success showed that when faced with risk, networks would always choose comfort over courage. The cancellation left deep scars on Tom and Dick. Tom took it the hardest, admitting years later that losing the show broke his confidence and left him feeling empty for a long time. Dick tried to distract himself with other passions like car racing and winemaking, but both brothers were forever changed by the experience. In 1970, just a year after CBS fired them, the Smothers Brothers tried again, this time on ABC. But the cultural mood had shifted. The Vietnam War was winding down, audiences were less interested in rebellious humor, and ABC kept a close watch, telling them to keep things safe. The show quickly lost steam, ratings dropped, and the network canceled it after a short run. One year they had been cutting edge, and the next they already seemed out of step. By January 1975, they made another attempt on NBC. The premiere was a huge success, ranking as the 5th most-watched show in the country with a staggering 50% audience share, numbers that would be unheard of today. But behind the scenes, tension built between the brothers and their producer, Joe Hamilton. Tom wasn't even allowed to do retakes without losing part of his pay, and they were blocked from freely meeting with writers or speaking to the press. The restrictions crushed their creativity. Ratings sank, Hamilton walked away. And although NBC let Tom take control for the last few episodes, it was too late. Those final shows included daring jokes about cocaine and appearances by big names like George Carlin and Ringo Starr, but NBC canceled the show halfway through the season. Almost 20 years after CBS canceled them, something unexpected happened. In 1988, the network invited the Smothers Brothers back for a one-hour reunion special called the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, the 20th reunion. It was a softer, nostalgic version of their old show. Writers like Steve Martin and Bob Einstein returned, and the special earned 3 Emmy nominations. That same year, CBS brought them back again for a full revival series. But timing was against them. The Writers Guild was on strike, forcing the brothers to rely on old routines and their guests for much of the comedy. When new scripts finally arrived, ratings rose slightly and the show even earned 5 Emmy nominations, but the revival never matched the original's impact. It lasted only 2 seasons before ending in 1989. Even though their later shows never found the same magic, the Smothers Brothers' place in history was secure. In 2022, UC Santa Barbara preserved their entire archive, including contracts, legal papers, photos, music sheets, and recordings, alongside the Library of Congress. This collection honors their fight for free speech and their influence on American comedy. Their original run from 1967 to 1969 had only lasted 2 years, but in that time they helped redefine what comedy could be. They weren't afraid to talk about war, censorship, or politics, long before shows like Saturday Night Live existed. Writers like Lorne Michaels, who would go on to create SNL, were influenced by their boldness. Later generations of comedians, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, John Oliver, and Samantha Bee, followed the path they had cleared, using comedy as a way to challenge power and make audiences think. The Smothers Brothers also gave a platform to future legends like Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, and George Carlin, who credited the show for helping them launch their careers. When CBS canceled them in 1969, they fought back in court and won, proving that networks couldn't simply silence artists under the excuse of censorship. But more importantly, they showed that comedy could be more than entertainment. It could be a tool for truth. Their show became a bridge between mainstream America and the counterculture, introducing audiences to voices like The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Simon and Garfunkel, and folk singer Pete Seeger, who had once been banned for his anti-war songs. They even brought audiences new music videos, like the Beatles' Hey Jude. Bill Maher once summed up their legacy perfectly. The Smothers Brothers weren't trying to please everyone. They were willing to upset people if it meant speaking honestly. They showed that comedy could take a stand and still matter. Even after their show was canceled, That lesson lived on. And it still matters today.